go.
Okay, this is Fred.
Okay. Do I sound okay, or am I weird?
Okay.
My picture's frozen.
Ready? Misha, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
Real quickly, Misha, remind me how to record. Oh, here it is. It says record. Can I, will you let me into it?
Okay. Yeah, it should.
Okay, it says, please request permission. So let me know.
I'm going to stop my video and see if that helps.
Okay. Forgive me, Misha, have you given me, can I hit okay on record?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
My back's hurting real bad. I actually took a Tramadol too Tylenol. I know it'll get better if I keep walking, but I'll do my exercises too afterwards.
Shelby, can you hear me?
Turn it over. To what? Oh, well, okay. It's not set up yet. That's why I was trying to set up. They're not set up yet.
Tina, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I'm going to have to go out and come back in because everything's freezing on me.
Leave it alone, please.
So I'll be right back.
Okay.
Greetings to everyone while we're waiting. I'm going to ask a question. I'm getting a little bit of static. So can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good.
I can hear you, but I am hearing the static.
Okay. It may be the weather. Do you remember the old days whenever there was a thunderstorm within 2 states, the black and white TVs would just go erratic? I hope we're not experiencing that.
No.
Okay. Might be a little bit better lighting. Well, since we met last, we've celebrated, I say celebrated, we've experienced another anniversary of 9/11. While we're waiting on Mish, I'll share something with you. A friend of mine actually was not only in the Pentagon that day, but quite literally was where the plane hit. She worked on the top floor, and I believe the Pentagon is 4 stories. And she worked for the Navy Department with their computers. She'd been doing that for quite a long time. And basically, they knew that there was a plane in the air. They knew that something was happening. They had no idea the Pentagon was, of course, a target. And it hit exactly where she was. The only good news was that that was the one part of the Pentagon that had recently been renovated to absorb, a major blow like that. So that the bottom 3 floors were destroyed, and that's where everybody was killed. But the top floor, the windows bowed in and they bowed out, and she and the others in that area were evacuated. And So she had quite a terrifying experience that day, but quite literally was at ground zero for the terrible things that were happening. Well, has everybody else had a pretty decent few days?
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Shelby, are you on the line? Okay.
Yes, I'm here, Fred. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I'm looking for instructions. I don't know whether to begin or to wait on Misha. So just
Well, I'm not sure about Misha, but let's go ahead and get started if you're ready.
okay. Thank you. By the way, just a word to Shelby. I really appreciated the fact that you did a quick turnaround on the recording of the last lecture. That was very helpful to me. And so just for everybody's information, working with Texas Tech is and the people at the OLLI program has been exemplary. They seem to have their act together, though sometimes I get the impression, as it always is true in academia, not just with them, that the column you see on the top is a duck, and what's underneath the duck is those feet moving about as fast as they can in desperation. But thank you, Misha, for getting that to me. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay. Wow. We're ready for the second installment in the second series of our rather detailed examination of the Civil War. And I've entitled this one Opening Moves. In our last lesson, we had established the Confederate States of America. We had looked at basically what it took for the first 7 states to leave the Union, and the kind of both the maneuvering that happened, the emotions that happened, and the motives for what happened. The maneuvering and the emotions and the motives. Slavery, obviously, is undergirding everything. And we're going to, ouch. We're going to see that again as we proceed through this section of opening moves. I'd like to set a mood, if I can. We've all had crises in our lives. Some of them are bad crises. Most often we associate a crisis with bad things. And some of them are good things, but you don't know what to do next. You know, something momentous has happened. That lovely young woman that you were courting said yes, and that's great. That's what you were working for. So what do you do now? You know, well, I guess we plan a marriage, and then there are all kinds of steps that have to be taken before you have the wedding ceremony, the honeymoon, and the rest of your lives. Or I related the incident last time about the time that Bonnie came on campus when I was teaching in my first assignment, first year of my first assignment. And she said, we need to talk. And it was kind of that we need to talk like we need to talk right now. So I could tell something had changed, something was important. And of course, within a few moments, she explained to me that she just found out for sure that we were expecting our first child. And very excited. We talked for literally 2 hours right there at the campus center, just the two of us. And then all of a sudden, when we kind of talked about as much as we could, we paused and I said, well, what do we do next? And I remember very well, she said, well, I guess we wait, because, you know, what do you do next? And so if you will, kind of get that idea in mind. Plus, in this case, things have changed, and they've changed in a hurry, and it's a crisis. It's a situation you've never faced before. So on April 12, 1861, the bombardment of Fort Sumter is going to change everything. And there's a crisis, and things are going to happen afterwards. But there is no standard operating procedure. There's no plan laid out for what happens. You quite literally have to make an assessment of what has happened. What are we going to do? What are going to be the consequences of it? And then what do you do beyond that? I remember again, another time of crisis, this one I experienced, and most of us, well, all of us that are in this session experienced. And that was that awful day on September 11, 2001. On that particular morning, I did something that's kind of rare for me. I showed up in my office at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm not a morning person by any stretch of the imagination. And so I tried to typically get into my office about 8:30 and have a class about 9 o'clock. But a young woman from England wasn't doing as well in my class as she wanted, and she was a person of great ability. And so I agreed to meet her at 8 o'clock. And there we are sitting in kind of a common area in the history department with my administrative assistant not far away. And I began to look at her notes and make some suggestions, and she was being very kind, and I was doing my best to be helpful. And then all of a sudden, my administrative assistant, Carla, said, oh my goodness, she was looking at her computer, a plane has flown into one of the Twin Towers. Well, that's tragic, but I was concentrating with the student, and I said, yes, that's an awful thing. It reminds me of the time a plane flew into the Empire State Building. So I marked it down as a tragedy, but not something to take me away from the meeting I was having with that young woman from England. And then a few seconds later, a few minutes later, whatever it was, Carla said, my goodness, a second plane has landed in the other tower, or not landed, crashed in that other tower. And at that point, I remember saying to the young woman, I don't think we can continue. My country's gone to war, and I have no idea why. And of course, in common with the rest of us, we watched the awful events on television that morning. It threw me, as it threw many people, into an immediate state of shock. And then late in the afternoon, as the shock began to ease off a bit, and my brain got to thinking about, well, what does this mean? And I remember very well thinking, what this means is that this is going to play havoc on American civil liberties, that many of the freedoms, many of the things that we do are going to be called into question. And we're going to have some of our freedoms limited. And you know, that's exactly what happened. You can't get on an airplane today without practically taking off 90% of what you're wearing. You've got to let somebody open up your luggage and look at your luggage and look at your carry-on, and there are things that you cannot bring on. We've had to give up our liberties to have the kind of freedoms that we had before 9/11. It was necessary. It was made necessary by the events that happened that day. And so it's April 1861. 7 states have left the Union, declaring that they're going to create a new nation. But still things are tense. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. And then suddenly there's a bombardment at Fort Sumter, and everything is going to change. What happens next? And I would suggest to you that when you face a crisis like that, there are 2 kinds of things that have to happen.
Get the computer out of it.
Okay. There are 2 kinds of things that have to happen. The first thing is that you have to deal with the immediate crisis. You have to deal with what's going on. And the second is that you need to be able to somehow step back a little bit and figure out, when you can, how you're going to deal with it in the long run. So there's a need for immediate action, and there's a need to come up with a plan for how to deal with a crisis that no one has written the book on how to deal with. And so on April 15th, 3 days after the bombardment of Fort Sumter began, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed that part of the United States was in a state of rebellion. And he called for 75,000 volunteers to help put this rebellion down. I've often wondered, where did he come up with that number 75,000? And the answer eventually I found out was, that was the legal limit. There was a law that went all the way back to 1795 that said, in times of emergency, the President of the United States can call up the state militia to the limit of 75,000 for 3 months service. Now, Abraham Lincoln knew on April 15 that 75,000 was insufficient. And he certainly knew that 3 months service would not be sufficient either. But that was the legal limit of what he could do. He had to take an immediate action. So it was as much symbolic as it was real action. And that symbolism will have a powerful, intensely powerful effect. Let me repeat that. It's as much symbolism as it is a real action, because he needed to make a statement, a symbolic statement. We are going to take action. This represents the action we're going to take, and it's the most that the law would allow him to do. Of course, as soon as possible, he's going to get Congress to change the law, because ultimately it's going to take an army of about 2 million people in the American North and a little less than 1 million people fighting for the American South to prosecute this war. So this was simply his symbolism, his statement. We're taking action. And there will be a reaction to that symbolism. Part of that reaction to symbolism occurred down in Montgomery, Alabama, because Montgomery, Alabama was at that point in time the capital of the Confederate States of America. And President Jefferson Davis, provisional president of the Confederacy, responded by saying that he appreciated Congress authorizing him to raise an army of 100,000 to respond to this aggressive act on the part of Abraham Lincoln, as he would describe it. And so he's addressing the Confederate Congress in Montgomery, and he's predicting that a war is going to occur, and we will raise a magnificent army of 100,000 volunteers. Now, again, nothing particular has happened yet. Neither side has any kind of army that would even begin to match that. So in other words, they're using rhetoric to express what we're going to do. And as Jefferson Davis continued that rhetoric, he pointed something else out. Not only are we going to raise an army, but we need to deal with the remaining slave states. 7 slave states had left the Union, but there were 15 slave states that represented potential additions to the Confederate States of America. And in fact, if the Confederate States of America was to succeed, were needed. So in the same address, Jefferson Davis made this statement, talking to the legislature, talking to the Confederate Congress. He said, "I cannot doubt that ere you shall have been many weeks in session, the whole of the slaveholding states of the American late Union will respond to the call of honor and affection, and by uniting their fortunes with ours, prompt our common interest and secure our common safety. Secure our common safety." In other words, he's saying to Congress, he expects the remaining 8 states, 8 slaveholding states, to join. Now, he didn't know that they would join, but he is making the guess it would, and it's part of the propaganda. It's part of the expectation. And so in this lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to explore the development of how we sorted out the remaining states and how we began the process of marching toward the Civil War, and the creation of the entity of the Confederate States of America, and ultimately the 13 states of the Confederacy. 13 of the 15 slave states. To appreciate that, and to appreciate the situation that existed in mid-April 1861, I want us to go back to Edmund Ruffin that we introduced last week. Edmund Ruffin is almost one of those forgotten figures in American history. And yet, in my thinking, and remember that my field of interest is American thought, I think that Edmund Ruffin was probably one of the deeper thinkers, more insightful thinkers of the antebellum, the pre-Civil War period. That's not to say that I agree with him. In other words, to say that somebody is a thoughtful thinker is not necessarily to say that they're right, or that there's somebody you like, or that there's somebody that you agree with. But Ruffin, who had dreamed of the creation of a Southern nation, who had developed an antipathy to the North in his anti-slave position, who was a proponent of slavery and a person who argued rather not only strongly in favor of slavery, but had, this is difficult to explain, slavery obviously is not right, but he made his case for slavery. And he was one of the most articulate people to make the case for slavery, the pro-slave argument. And in addition to that, he had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen starting in 1861. And he wrote this book with that awful title, Anticipations of the Future, to serve as a lesson for the present times. What does he mean, you know, anticipation of the future to serve as lessons for the present time? I'm not a grammarian. In fact, I have enough grades in English to absolutely prove to you that I'm not a grammarian. But one of my favorite tenses when looking at verbs is the future past participle. That is to say, speaking of the past in the future. Example of that might be to say, by the time that we have the next lecture, I will have made my way to East Tennessee, and I'll be giving the next lecture from my little cabin. In other words, I've talked about the past as it will exist in the future. And I love using that present past participle. So anticipations of the future to serve as lessons for the present time is his way of saying, I want us to go to the future and look back on the past as it appears in this little novel that, that he wrote in the forms of explaining how a civil war developed, and after that civil war developed, how in his view, it would lead to a Confederate victory. And
Fred, if you can hear me, you're cutting in and out. We may have lost him. Tina, can you hear me?
I can,
Okay. Can you hear Fred?
not at all. And his video is frozen.
It's frozen.
So,
okay,
oh, Fred, are you back?
I'm here.
Okay, you cut out for a little bit, and I know Misha has had a really hard time trying to get on, so I'm wondering if there's an issue there in Abilene with your Wi-Fi.
It's entirely possible. You know, we live in this little little burg called Abilene.
Yeah.
It's not like the big city there in Lubbock or Dallas or Fort Worth or someplace, you know, more modern.
Well, now you're good. So keep going, and I will mute myself again.
Okay, thank you. By the way, every so often, I get a little notice myself here that says you're unstable. And it reminds me of my age, and I think it's making a comment more on me than it is the computer. Well, let's go back to this. Ruffin, writing as if he was talking from the future back to the past, argued that in 1861, the Lower South would be enthusiastic for slavery. Well, he was right. Only it was more enthusiastic than he planned. He didn't anticipate that the Lower South would actually create a separate nation in 1861. He thought that would not occur until 1864 or 1865. On the other hand, he did correctly predict that the upper slave states would be reticent. Notice what he says. Their reticence grew out of their more exposed and dangerous position. If war should ensue, he wrote in his book, and the border states be made the chief battlegrounds as predicted to be ravaged and laid waste at time after time by contending armies. In other words, he predicted that the upper slave states would be more reticent, not quite ready to join the Confederacy. So by April 1865, 7 states had proven ready, the deep slave states where slavery was the most intense and most critical to the culture, to his surprise, had actually left the Union and created a nation. But as he correctly predicted, the reticence of the remaining 8 states was extremely strong. And so we want to look at these remaining states in two phases, in 2 distinct patterns as it led to secession. The first would be what I call divided loyalties. And they will be the states of Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And when those four states will leave the Union, they will constitute, along with the other 7 states, the original 11 states of the Confederacy. And then secondly, we'll look at an additional phase in which the states of Maryland and Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky will be held in the balance. And I will suggest to you that at least in a token level, 2 of those states will leave the Union, and that a great deal of sophistication will occur in the maneuvering in those states. We're going to see how people can be somewhat sophisticated and how people can be very strong-handed as we look at this marginal South, the South of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, and they're leaving the Union. So let's look at the second phase of secession, roughly April to June 1861. And there are basically 4 kinds of things that were happening in these states. Let's just list them. If you went to these 4 states, the states of Virginia and Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, they would more or less have in common the fact that they all had clear geographic divisions that related to slavery and to the differences in society and to the attitude on secession. They're all going to have geography that will mean that some parts of the states are going to support secession. Other parts of the state will not. And there's going to be societal differences. In fact, the beginnings of Southern class conflict really begins during the Civil War. There were distinct class differences before the Civil War, but it rarely ever led to what I would call conflict. The Civil War will enhance the social class differences that exist in the Civil War, especially in the Upper South, and lead to conflicts that will mature during the Civil War and will continue well beyond the American Civil War. and in some ways still continue to this day in many parts of the South. Secondly, each of these states will have powerful political figures that will be urging secession, and will have to do in their own way a great deal of manipulation in order to get these four states to leave the Union and to cast their lot with the Confederacy. Third, we'll see the social class differences that existed within these states. And fourth, we'll see that even after secession, even after they've cast their lot with the Confederacy, there will be divided loyalties with significant Union support in each of those four states. So this is phase two, when four more states will leave the Union, the states of Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Virginia will be the next state to leave the Union, and it will do so fairly quickly after Fort Sumter, and it will establish a pattern that will be followed by all four of these states. Virginia will formally leave the Union and declare for the Confederacy on May 6, 1861. May 6, 1861. In 1860, Virginia had a population of over 1 million, about 1,150,000 free people, and of slaves, just shy of 500,000 slaves. So about less than 30%, about 28, 29% of the population was invested in slavery. More importantly, though, if you look at the map of Virginia, you can clearly see where slavery existed and where it was unimportant. The intensity of slavery in Virginia was in that area called the Tidewater, the area from the Atlantic Ocean till you get to what's called the fall line, and where the rivers are estuaries, meaning that they rise and fall with the tide, and hence the term Tidewater, where tobacco plantations dominated, and where slavery was an intense part of the culture. And then beyond the fall line, until you begin to get into rather hilly country, you have a wide area called the Piedmont. And again, the Piedmont is an area of plantations and of slavery. The only significant difference between the Tidewater and the Piedmont is transportation. You don't have the quality of transportation in terms of river systems in the Piedmont that you had in the Tidewater, but you still have that intensity of plantation culture and of slavery as an important element of the culture. Virginia is somewhat unique in that it has a strip of land that runs diagonally across the street called the Valley, or more often we hear it called the Shenandoah Valley. This Shenandoah Valley is going to be critical all through the course of the Civil War. Critical for a couple of reasons. One, it's a breadbasket. It's a place of yeoman farmers, small farmers. In many ways, its economic aspect is more aligned with, say, that of Ohio or Indiana or Illinois, in that it was a wheat culture instead of a cotton culture. And it was noted with small farmers. Now, they had slaves, but you don't have the big plantations. And you have a lot of farmers who don't have slaves. So the Shenandoah Valley is going to be marginally loyal to the Confederacy, but absolutely occupied by the Confederacy. And it's occupied by the Confederacy throughout for two reasons. First, of course, is what I mentioned a moment ago. It's a breadbasket. It's a place where you draw on supplies, food supplies, critical to the feeding of the Confederate armies and to the civilians that were part of the Confederacy. But then secondly, because it was a valley and reasonably flat, and that valley continues on down into Tennessee, it's the location of an important railroad. I'm going to say that again. It's the location of a critically important railroad called the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. The East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. Whoever controlled that railroad controlled communication from the upper South to the lower South. Communication in terms of information, communication in terms of troop movements, and communication in terms of supplies. And so maintaining control of the valley on the part of the Confederacy is going to be paramount. And that's where ultimately Thomas Stonewall Jackson will be critically important, because he will be the commander that will not only demonstrate his abilities as one of the more exceptional generals of the Civil War, but as a general who kept the Shenandoah Valley in the control of the Confederacy for most of the American Civil War. Once the valley fell, as it would fall in 1864 to the Union armies, the Confederacy was, for all practical purposes, doomed. And then the fourth area of Virginia in 1860-61 was the mountain region. A region that, if you think about the map of Virginia today, doesn't quite seem right, because you're thinking of the state of West Virginia. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the mountain region was exactly what it says it is. It was part of the Appalachian chain that runs all the way from Maine down to Georgia. Transportation extremely difficult, noted with lots of rivers and valleys. And well, since I have property in East Tennessee, I'll just call it what it is, hollers. And here you have people for whom slavery is in existence. There's slavery there, but it's very unimportant. It's a very small percentage of the population. And with rare exceptions, such as a salt mine, for example, that exists in that area in Kanawha County, slavery is not critical to that culture. And in fact, the social ties of that area are much more with Ohio than they will be with the Confederacy. And so as Virginia moves towards secession, you've got to take into consideration there's certain parts of that state that favor leaving the Union, but there are other parts of that state who are just as adamant about not leaving the Union. 1860, well, there was presidential election. Here's a pattern you've seen before. Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballot in Virginia. You couldn't vote for him if you'd wanted to or been foolish enough to try to vote for him. On the other hand, Stephen Douglas gets some votes, about 16,000. And then you'll see this several times. Bell will carry the state. John Bell is the old Whig party that wanted to stay in the Union, but to stay in the Union preserving slavery. And John Breckinridge is the Southern Democrat. And a vote for Breckinridge is pretty much a vote for, if a Republican is elected, we're leaving the Union. In the case of Virginia, Bell will carry the state of Virginia, but look how close it is. He wins the state by about 150 votes, 74,480, 81 for Bell. Breckinridge gets 74,325. That's about roughly 175 to 180 votes. And yes, I do not have a PhD in math, so we'll just have to do the best we can with that. But once again, if you put the Breckinridge and Bell votes together, these are people who want to see slavery preserved, but many of them are not quite as fanatical enough to say we're ready to leave the Union, as represented by the vote for John Bell. So what happens? Well, those who are in favor of slavery, and there were quite a number, principally led by a former governor by the name of Wyeth, they insisted that Virginia elect a Congress, a convention, to consider secession. And in January 1861, voters elected 152 delegates to a secessionist convention that would meet in Richmond. But to the surprise of the pro-secession people, when that convention met, far more Unionists than secessionists were elected. Now, doing reading about that convention can be rather tedious, to be honest with you. And so I'm not going to go into detail between the strong Unionist, the provisional Unionist, the moderates, and the radical secessionists. There were basically four different groups. But in the initial vote in April 4th, 1861, the vote was 90 delegates in favor of remaining in the Union and 45 delegates in favor of leaving the Union. In other words, initially, Virginia voted to remain in the Union. But the pro-secessionists, the people that wanted to see Virginia out of the Union, they did have enough power to say, let's leave the convention in session. Let's see what happens next. In other words, it was a delaying tactic. They had lost the initial vote. They weren't yet able to pull off leaving the Union, but they wanted to wait and see. And as it turned out, it didn't take very long for them to find out what was going to happen. Because on April 12, 13, you had the bombardment of Fort Sumter. And on April 15, Abraham Lincoln makes that call, that very strong, very powerful, but really symbolic call for 75,000 volunteers. And when he makes that call for 75,000 volunteers, the Army Department then assigns to each state the number of volunteers that it would have to provide for the 75,000 volunteers, and that included the state of Virginia. At that point, there was a powerful negative reaction, to Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers. The more radicals said that to use language I've unfortunately heard recently, in this case, President Lincoln is making war upon the American people. That's the way that, in essence, they were expressing it. Or more specifically, President Lincoln is making war upon Southerners just like us. Among those that were, from the beginning, powerful advocates of leaving the Union was somebody who I think you should be aware of. His name was George Wyeth Randolph. Now today, very few of us know who George Wyeth Randolph was, but of course, he was the grandson of someone we are familiar with, Thomas Jefferson, one of the key founders of our country. He is Washington only had by his wife daughters. Now by his wife's half-sister, who was also a slave, Sally Hennings, he had several children, which were both sons and daughters. But of his legitimate children, he only had two daughters, and then one of the daughters gave birth to George Wyeth Randolph. And Randolph will briefly be, for in the future, one of the secretaries of war for the Confederacy. Unfortunately for him, his health collapsed, and he was only able to serve as Secretary of War for a few weeks. But at any rate, here's what he said. Lincoln has said we want 75,000 volunteers, but this grandson of Thomas Jefferson said, a withdrawal from the present Union seems to be the safest and best course for us to pursue. The North will wield all its patronage of government, and we shall be powerless. And that argument prevailed. As a result, on April 17th, just 2 days later, the secessionists will be victorious, and they will vote 88 to 55 to leave the Union. But notice, there are 55 delegates that vote to remain in the Union. It's not unanimous. Virginia is divided. And as a result of that division, there was a call to affirm what the convention had done. Let's let the people vote. Let's have a referendum on it. We're going to take Virginia out of the Union, but before we finalize it, let the people speak. And so there was a election, May 23rd, 1861, where the people of Virginia were given the opportunity to express themselves. To briefly bring our contemporary world into this, there are a lot of people today who are setting up the possibility of a contended election that will occur in a few weeks here in the United States. That is to say, they're setting up a situation where they will argue that a lot of shenanigans went on. Well, in May 1861, there's no question about it. A great deal of shenanigans went along. And the vote, the people's vote, came out 125,000, almost 126,000 in favor of the ordinance of secession, to only 20,000 against. So that sounds like the enthusiasm for secession was overwhelming. But the reality is that a lot of the votes of the mountain counties weren't counted. They were declared to be invalid. And all over the state, you did not vote in secret ballot. Repeat that, you don't vote in secret ballot. You drop your ballot into a bowl that says, I'm either for secession or against secession. And as the cartoon above suggests, if you wanted to vote yes, you were welcomed. And if you wanted to vote no, well, there was the equivalent of a bayonet in the window to say that not a wise thing to vote against secession. In fact, as one Union person said, my sympathies were with the Union cause, but I did not talk much in favor of the Union. I had to be careful how I expressed my sentiment. I feared that I would be arrested if I spoke very much. And so there you have it, a real fear, an intense fear, that to express yourself as being against secession put your life at risk. As a result of that, the anti-secessionist people held their own convention in Wheeling, West Virginia. Wheeling is almost in Ohio. It's that little bitty finger that goes straight up into Ohio. And one of the leaders was John S. Carlisle. And this convention, of course, is going to vote in favor of the Union. A little bit shenanigans. You had shenanigans in the popular vote. But what the Wheeling Convention does is also a little bit of shenanigans. The people of the Wheeling Convention declares themselves to be the representative government of Virginia, what it called the restored government of Virginia. And so they're claiming not to represent a portion of Virginia, the western portion. They're claiming to represent the entire state of Virginia. So they elect senators. Carlisle becomes one of the senators of the restored government of Virginia, and a governor and congressman. And the Lincoln government recognizes as the legitimate government of Virginia the restored government of Virginia, the people that met in assembly in Wheeling. Now, why is that important? Why is it important that this restored government of Virginia came into being and was recognized as the legitimate government by Abraham Lincoln? And the answer is move forward 2 years to 1863. Under the Constitution of the United States, under the Constitution of the United States, it stated that no state can be divested of its territory without the permission of that state. No state can be divested of its territory without the permission of that state. So if the restored government of Virginia is the government of Virginia, and the Lincoln administration had recognized that, then the restored government of Virginia had the right to grant permission for a portion of its territory to separate and form a separate state. And in 1863, that's exactly what happened. The restored government of Virginia gave permission to the counties that now constitute West Virginia to separate and form a separate state. Otherwise, West Virginia would not be a legal state. Of course, the question comes back, what was the legal government of Virginia? And the answer is people who represented essentially only the counties that became West Virginia. But that's the kind of legal maneuvering that both the Union and the Confederacy will do all the way through the Civil War. It's not just one, it's several that are doing it. One side or other, it's both sides that are doing it. Before we leave Virginia, I want to take just a second to visit with John Tyler, former president of the United States, and the only president of the United States to be proven to have committed treason. John Tyler became president in 1841. If you remember the old slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, it's because William Henry Harrison, a Whig, was running for president, and he had the nickname Old Tippecanoe, referring to a battle that occurred on the eve of the War of 1812. And so it was said, you know, this military leader, Old Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, and his vice presidential candidate, John Tyler. Elected in 1840, William Henry Harrison began a tradition that continued for quite a long time. And that was the tradition that every Whig, or eventually Republicans that followed Whigs, elected in a year ending in 0 would die in office. That included, among others, Abraham Lincoln. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States, and he almost died in office. And some very good friends of mine who are Democrats argued that he actually did die in office. It's just that he kept breathing, but that's a different issue. So, so that was the situation. William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia about 30 days into his office. And then what do you do? What is the status of John Tyler? Is he the president or is he the acting president? The Constitution did not make that clear. His one and only contribution to the presidency was he insisted that he was the president of the United States. Otherwise, he was almost a total failure as president, and much criticized. Some argue the most criticized president ever in the history of the United States, although there certainly seems to be, our current president is in the running for the most criticized president ever in the history of the United States. After he finished his office of presidency, he retired. He had a new wife. His first wife, by whom he had 8 children, died while he was president. He married a young woman 30 years his junior and proceeded to have an additional 7 children by her. And incidentally, his last 2 grandsons only recently died in the year 2019. And so John Tyler basically went back to Virginia, to his plantation, to his slaves, and he and his young wife began to raise a second family. But in 1861, in the crisis of the Union, he at first tried to find a compromise, much like John Bell was arguing for a compromise. And he chairs the Washington Peace Conference in February of 1861, where the people in attendance at that conference looked for various ways that they could preserve the Union, but at the same time preserve slavery. And in the end, they couldn't find one. And when they couldn't find one, he returned to Virginia. He joined the Virginia Secessionist Convention. He voted in favor of secession. He was elected to the Confederate Congress when it was going to meet in Richmond. And he did not serve simply because he expired before that Congress met. In other words, he died before we met. But he's the only president of the United States to, in essence, commit treason in the history of the United States. When he died in early 1862, Abraham Lincoln said nothing. Normally, on the death of a president, there were certain honors that went to the president, the flag flying at half-staff, for example. But instead, Abraham Lincoln chose to ignore the fact that this former president of the United States, who had left the Union, who had sided with the Confederacy, who had become a Confederate congressman, and then passed away, received no honors, no flags at half-mast, no mention by the President of the United States, a statement of mourning and of sorrow. When we think of Virginia, we like to think of sophistication. When we think of Arkansas, I was born in Arkansas. I was raised a good portion of my life in Arkansas. I was educated as an undergraduate in Arkansas. And I resent the fact, to some extent, that people associate Arkansas with a lack of sophistication. Though I will hasten to add, sometimes it's absolutely deserved. So let's go to Arkansas. It's the next state that will leave the Union. It will leave the Union on May 6th, 1861. May 6, 1861. In 1860, Arkansas had a population of 325,000 free inhabitants, 111,000 slave inhabitants. And incidentally, here's a little figure that people almost never see. It had the smallest number of free blacks of any state, about 800. It was absolutely illegal to be a free black and live in Arkansas. But there were about 800 free blacks who had become free before that legislation was passed. And so Arkansas had the lowest number of free blacks of any state in the Union. But still, slightly less than 1 out of every 4 inhabitants of the state were slaves. And if you look at the way that the state is divided, notice that I divided it by drawing a straight line from Missouri Boot Heel down to roughly where Texarkana is. And above that line is essentially hill country, piney woods, and mountains, small mountains, but mountains nonetheless, the Ozark Mountains and the Boston Mountains, which are really Boston Hills, and piney woods. If you ever travel from, say, Texarkana to Little Rock, up Interstate 30, notice the fact that on both sides of the road, they're pine trees. Wherever in the South you see pine trees, you're going to have small farmers. You're going to have land that's not particularly fertile. It's good enough to grow corn. It's good enough to raise pigs, but it's not good enough to engage in the kind of commercial agriculture that slavery has. And so in the northwest part of Arkansas, a region that is not particularly appealing to the institution of slavery, in southeast Arkansas, slavery would be intense. And by the way, for the record, the place of my nativity, the place of my birth is in southeast Arkansas, almost on the Mississippi River, right in the middle of what they call bayou country. And I think the thing they raise most there today is mosquitoes. They have a very profitable mosquito enterprise in the part of Arkansas that I am from. So when it came to the election of 1860, here's your pattern. No Abraham Lincoln on the ballot. On the other hand, Douglas gets a small vote, about 5,000. Breckinridge the person most intense in favor of slavery. He carried those Delta counties. He carried the Bayou counties, and he got a vote of almost 29,000, and Bell received a vote of about 20,000. So Arkansas is definitely a state where the interest of slavery is important to a significant number of people. And that brings us to the recently elected governor. His name was Henry M. Rector. And if ever you needed somebody in a time of crisis who was intelligent, who was wise, who could size up a situation and do well, please do not select somebody like Henry M. Rector. He absolutely, well, he just wasn't the best governor Arkansas or any other state ever had. Essentially what happened was Rector was a successful politician from the Hot Springs area, which would be the Boston Mountains. And he was actually quite a wealthy man. His father owned timber business, owned sawmills. He inherited the money, but his interest was politics. And he'd been successful, but he recognized that there was a division between the people of the hill country and the people of the Delta. And in 1860, he ran for governor, but he ran for governor, well, there's a favorite chapter in the book I like, and the title of the chapter is The Wigs Take to the Woods. In other words, the conservative business types of the antebellum period knew that they could not get elected by running as businessmen, so they took to the woods. They pretended to be men of the people. And so here you have this very wealthy man, Henry Rector, but he runs from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and his position is, I'm just a poor, honest farmer from Saline County, that's Hot Springs, who toils at the plow handles to provide meat and bread and raiment for my wife and children. In other words, I'm just a small farmer. And the small farmers of the hill country loved him. The people in the Delta were suspicious of him, but by a very small margin, he eked out a victory in the election of 1860. But then comes the crisis almost immediately of the election of a Republican as president of the United States. And it turns out that Rector is a fervent pro-slave person, which would appeal to the Delta. And now he comes out in favor of secession, in favor of slavery, in opposition to Lincoln, in opposition to the North. And when it all happens, neither side come to trust him. The people of the hill country think he's a turncoat. The people of the Delta are reminded that he had appealed originally to the people of the hill country. But as we talked about in the last election, he does make one statement that pretty well defines what's going on. He said in his first address to the Arkansas legislature, the South wants practical evidence of good faith from the North, not mere paper or agreements. The North believes slavery is a sin, the South does not, and therein lies our trouble. Therein lies our trouble. So what happens? He begins to realize, Rector begins to realize that he's lost his support in the hill country. And so he tries to gain support from the Delta region, the region that wants to secede. So even before Arkansas leaves the Union, he in effect declares war on the United States. He begins to encourage actions that will lead to secession. And the first of these actions that he tries to encourage is the seizure of the federal arsenal in Little Rock. Every state had an arsenal. Every state had an arsenal that was provided by the federal government in the event that the militia would be called up and need immediate arms and ammunition and uniforms. And so one of his cabinet officers sends the very first telegram that is ever sent out of the city of Little Rock to warn the very pro-secessionist militia in Helena, Arkansas, that in their view, the federal arsenal and the 75 troops that are guarding that arsenal are up to no good. And then come paddling up the Arkansas River on the steamboat is somewhere between 500 and 1,000. We really don't know the number. But between 500 and 1,000 members of the militia from the Delta country, mostly from Helena. And they surround the arsenal to the point that the commander of the arsenal and the 75 federal troops there determined that rather than start the war, he was out of communication. He didn't know what was happening. It would be better to find a solution. And the solution that Rector offered was, I'll take care of the arsenal. Just deed it over to me, and I'll see to it that nothing bad happens. And so, in essence, the commander of the arsenal surrendered, deeded the arsenal over for overwatch, for good keeping, to the governor of Arkansas, who in turn turned it over to the Helena militia that was in favor of slavery, thus giving them arms and ammunition. By the way, what happened next was that militia marched to Fort Smith with the idea of taking over the substantial federal possessions in Fort Smith, only to find that the commander of Fort Smith had evacuated with all of his arms before that happened. And all of this is before Arkansas left the Union. So, on February 18, at the insistence of Rector, the people of Arkansas voted to create a secession convention in Little Rock. That convention met, but to the surprise of Rector and to the discontent of the Delta people, it voted by a very narrow margin to remain in the Union, to wait and see what was going to happen. And that was on March the 4th. And so for about a month, from March the 4th until April 12th, the convention met, it debated, but mainly it waited and watched. Sure enough, on April 12, 13, you have Fort Sumter, followed 2 days later by Abraham Lincoln calling for 75,000 volunteers. And at that point, when Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, the pro-secessionist gained the upper hand, and by a vote of 64 to 5, voted to remain, voted to leave the Union and to join the Confederacy. To leave the Union and join the Confederacy. By that time, pro-secessionist mobs, mainly that group from Helena, were constantly patrolling the streets of Little Rock. The Arkansas Gazette every day had, it was the media that gave the news only from the position of a pro-secession, pro-Confederacy viewpoint. And pressure was placed upon 4 of those delegates who, in turn, agreed to join with that group. And so it made it 69 now in favor of secession and 1 against. And that 1 against did not repent, in spite of the fact that the audience in the balcony were screaming to have him lynched. He remained firm in the Union. He would later become the Republican governor of Arkansas, and he would do a fairly decent job getting the state at least ready for the end of the American Civil War. As for Rector, Rector went back to Helena. His term was supposed to end in 1864, but because the newly established Confederate politicians didn't trust him, they rewrote the Constitution, so he had to run for re-election in 1862. He ran for re-election in 1862, and he lost overwhelmingly. Neither the Hill Country nor the Delta trusted the man. At that point, he volunteered for Confederate service, and he applied for a commission, meaning he wanted to be a general, and the government in Richmond ignored him. He joined the Home Guard, planning on being an officer, and he rose to the rank of private, serving basically the rest of the Civil War. North Carolina. North Carolina leaves the Union on May 20th, 1861. May 20th, 1861. North Carolina is a interesting state. In fact, I've been to North Carolina a lot. It's one of my favorite states. And it's rather plebeian, not aristocratic. And the reason is that even though Virginia is to the north, highly aristocratic, and South Carolina is to the south, even more aristocratic, Virginia never quite developed the intense aristocracy that you would find either to the north or the south. And the reason is fairly simple. Geography works against North Carolina. It does have a coastline, a tidewater, and a coastal plain, and slavery is very strong in those areas. It has a Piedmont, which some of the Piedmont is piney woods, and some of the Piedmont is fairly fertile soil where slavery can exist and exist profitably. But North Carolina has a real problem with transportation. Its Atlantic coast simply doesn't have any decent ports. The rivers that flow into it are too shallow. And so North Carolina never developed that heavy, intense, aristocratic culture that you find in Virginia or South Carolina. Still, it did have a population where the eastern portions of North Carolina were heavily dependent upon slaves. And when you begin to see the divisions in North Carolina, those divisions are there. The governor was John Willis Ellis, and from the beginning, he favored secession. He said 2 persons have been elected to the office of president and vice president exclusively by the people of one section. So far, every state we've looked at, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot. So he's going to be president, but only if elected by the people of the North. And he says, a clear case of foreign domination could not well be presented. In other words, it's just as if a foreigner, a Yankee, a Northerner has taken over the country that has no understanding or appreciation about what we are like. When you look at North Carolina, Lincoln wasn't on the ballot. Douglas, the Northern Democrat, wasn't on the ballot. Breckinridge gets 48,000 votes, almost 49,000 votes. Bill got 45,000 votes. Clearly, everybody there supports slavery, and a slight majority go for those who are the most intense in favoring slavery. But when you look at North Carolina, the dominant culture of North Carolina were the non-slaveholding yeoman farmers, in other words, the subsistence farmers. And they made up the majority of North Carolina voters in 1861. And they had little interest in the institution of slavery. They believed in it because they believed that, that it was the appropriate possession for people of African heritage. That was a common belief no matter what your social status was among whites. But they weren't intensely connected to slavery. And they had a reticence to leave the Union. On the other hand, when you look at those areas and districts that were pro-secession, you also find those areas and districts voting for secession that were led primarily by the plantation estates, led by the high aristocrats that did live in North Carolina. And so it's no surprise that the voting in favor of secession would be in the eastern counties where slavery was significant. And those who were reticent to leave the Union would be in the western counties, especially in the Piedmont, and especially in the mountain counties of the far western part of North Carolina. And in the referendum, which the state held in February 1861, the secessionists, by a tiny margin, by roughly about 700 or 800 votes, were victorious. In other words, those who favored the Union, 47,300. Those who favored leaving the Union and joining the Confederacy, about 46,700. So by roughly about 500 votes, a little less than 500 votes across the entire state, you have this division, and at least initially, they vote to stay in the Union. But then you have Fort Sumter, Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers on April 15th. That symbolism says we're going to do something about this rebellion, but that symbolism impacts the wavering states just as hard, and just in this case negative. And so once Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers, many of the Unionists switched sides. Many of the Unionists said, wait a minute, we're not going to make war upon our fellow white Southerners. Not going to make war upon our fellow white Southerners. And so notice here the support of one particular person who said, Lincoln has made us a unit to resist until we repel our invaders or die. And then he simply said, even so, the South has committed suicide. Well, this particular person, by the way, would support the Union initially. Later, he would be the treasurer of the state of North Carolina under the Confederacy. And in 1865, he would actually be elected governor of the of Confederate North Carolina. Confederate North Carolina is probably one of the great tragedies of the Civil War. North Carolina provided more troops to the Confederate cause than any other state. It also provided, because it was a breadbasket area, a significant amount of the sustenance, the food necessary for the Confederacy to exist and for its armies to fight. At the same time, North Carolinians suffered more casualties than any other Southern state. At the end of the war, there were more people missing arms and legs, having deformed faces where bullets had struck them in the jaw or the like, of losing their manhood than any other state in the Union. And as the war went on, no state suffered discontent with the Confederacy more than North Carolina. At the end of the war, it had a higher percentage of deserters than any other Southern state. And in fact, it had a higher percentage among its soldiers of deserters than any other Southern Confederate state. Tennessee. For a wide variety of reasons, I relate more to Tennessee than any of the other states. The fact that I earned my graduate degrees at the University of Tennessee, the fact that I wrote my master's thesis with a person who was a prominent Tennessee Unionist, and the fact that I stumbled across something very early in my professional career called the Tennessee Civil War Veterans Questionnaires, and gave me the opportunity to study about common soldiers, mainly from the Confederacy, makes me feel rather warm when I'm talking about the state of Tennessee during the Civil War. On the eve of the Civil War, 835,000 Tennesseans were free inhabitants, 275,000 were slaves, but again, look at the map. There's clear divisions of where slavery was. The most intense area of slavery were 11 counties in the far southwest corner of the state, in the area around Memphis and to the east of Memphis. You can't get west of Memphis and still be in Tennessee, by the way. And that area, the Memphis area, went overwhelmingly in favor of the Confederacy. But then look at Middle Tennessee, the area that includes Nashville, And you see what looks like a column right down the middle of the state. Well, that was another area of intense slave possessions. In this case, a culture of tobacco and a culture of raising fine-bred horses and mules, both of which will be extremely valuable to the Confederate cause. And so Tennessee then had two very distinct areas that favored slavery and favored the Confederacy. But it also had a significant amount of its area in which the Confederacy was not favored. Notice the word piney woods. Along the border between what is called Middle and West Tennessee, you see piney woods. And then, of course, as you head east into East Tennessee and into the mountains, piney woods. Wherever you find piney woods, wherever you find a large number of pine trees, the soil is going to be relatively unproductive. The citizens are going to be engaged in subsistence agriculture. Slavery is going to exist, but not be important or significant. And support for the Union and not support for the Confederacy is going to be extremely strong in those piney woods areas. And I can tell you from experience, from living in the West Tennessee piney woods area, there are places and knots of people who trace their ancestry all the way back to the Civil War and still consider themselves different and apart and suspicious of anyone that's not like them. But the governor of Tennessee was a secessionist firebrand. He wanted Tennessee to join the Confederacy. He believed in the Confederate cause. And so when Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, here's what Governor Isham G. Harris responded with. Tennessee will not furnish a single man for coercion, but 50,000 if necessary for the defense of our rights or for those of our Southern brethren. He pushed to have Tennessee leave the Union. In fact, in February 1861, he called for a statewide vote. And to his chagrin, the state voted against secession, largely because of the leadership of people in East Tennessee. Probably the most notable of these was Brownlow, the future governor of the state. Brownlow was a Methodist minister, but he also had gotten into the publishing business. He had what was called the Knoxville Wig, one of the most influential papers, not just in Tennessee, but in the entire South. And he despised the Confederate cause so strongly that in 1864, when he came back to Knoxville after the North had liberated the city, he changed the name of his paper from the Knoxville Wig to Brownlow's Knoxville Wig and Rebel Ventilator. That was to express his intense discontent with the Confederate cause. But in February of 1861, the Brownlow faction won. 70,000 Tennesseans voted against secession. 58,000 voted in favor. If you look at the voting, overwhelmingly in the mountain regions against secession. Middle Tennessee divided about even, and West Tennessee went about 2/3 for secession. So clearly, prior to the actual secession, there was strong Union support, but that support was regional in its base. After Fort Sumter, the Tennessee legislature in May, at the leadership of Isham G. Harris, formed what they called an alliance with the Confederacy. In other words, they declared themselves to be independent, and they said to the Confederate States of America, we will align with you. And if we get permission from the people to leave the Union, we will join the Confederacy. So to get permission, they had to have a vote. And on June 8th, there was a referendum. And this referendum overwhelmingly supported the Confederacy. Well, by this time, that alliance had in effect created a Confederate army from Tennessee and was already fighting the war with the Confederacy. So 105,000 voted in favor of secession. Almost all of those were from Middle and West Tennessee. And about 50,000 voted against secession, and almost all of those were from East Tennessee. Now, look what happens. In East Tennessee, the East Tennesseans said, wait a minute, we do not favor joining the Confederacy. And so they held two conventions. The Knoxville Convention of May 1861, followed a few weeks later by the Greenville Convention. These were organized by quite a number of pro-unionists, Brownlow, several congressmen, and even someone who normally would have been their enemy, Andrew Johnson, all supported the Union. Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator not to resign and leave the Union. Tennessee, he was from East Tennessee, from Greenville. The convention idea was created by an attorney in Knoxville. And the only reason that I'm going to mention him is because, well, he was the subject of a master's thesis, a man named Oliver Perry Temple. But it was in his office, his law office, the several unionists met and decided to call a convention in Knoxville, which they did. And in Knoxville, they declared their intent to create a separate state, a state that would remain loyal to the Union if Tennessee voted to leave the Union. Tennessee voted to leave the Union. And so in Greenville, on June 17 through 21, the Greenville Convention, which followed the Knoxville Convention, obviously, the Greenville Convention voted to create a separate state called East Tennessee. Now, in Virginia, you do end up with a separate state, West Virginia. But in Tennessee, it doesn't happen. And the reason is simple. You remember the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia? That same valley continues into Tennessee. It goes right through Knoxville all the way down to Chattanooga. And along that valley is the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. In other words, Confederate authorities could not afford to let that vital railroad, the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad, fall into foreign hands, fall into the hands of the North. And so immediately upon secession, and immediately upon the declaration of East Tennesseans that they wished to leave the state, Confederate forces were sent into East Tennessee and occupied that region. For the remaining of the war, East Tennessee would be the site of small actions, mostly along the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. Hundreds of scrimmages and thousands of people will die and become maimed for the protection, for the defense of, or the damage to that railroad, the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. And East Tennessee will never become a separate state from the state of Tennessee. So those are the four states that formally joined the Confederacy. All of them provided a majority of the fighting forces for the Confederacy. More battles were fought in those four states than any other area of the Confederacy. And their people suffered much more than people further to the south would suffer over the course of the war. And yet, that's not all of the slave states. That's only 11. 4 slave states remained. And I would argue that in 1861, the whole fate of the nation depended on what happened in those 4 slave states. If those states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, if those states had left the Union, you would have created, in terms of strategy, in terms of military maneuvering, an extremely difficult situation for those who wanted to defeat the Confederacy. The boundary of the Confederacy would have been the Ohio River. The depth of the Confederacy would have been deep, and the intensity of invading the South, of occupying Southern territory, would probably have been, or possibly have been, overwhelming. And so while Lincoln really could do little to keep Virginia and Arkansas and North Carolina and Tennessee officially in the Union, he had to do everything he could do in order to keep the remaining 4 slave states in the Union. A typical statement is sometimes made: Lincoln didn't fight the war for slavery. After all, he didn't declare slavery to be a war goal until January of 1863. But the truth of the matter is, it was about slavery from the beginning. But Lincoln dared not proclaim that for fear of tipping the balance in favor of the slaveholders in the states of Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and possibly Delaware. Lincoln could not declare the war to be about slavery because there were still 4 slave states: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And each of those 4 states are going to be dealt with differently. But it was critical to keep at least 3 of those 4 states in the Union if the North was to have any hope of winning the American Civil War. So in a very real sense, what we're going to talk about in a second is really where the war was either won or lost. Lost for the Confederacy or won for the North. The border states, the outcome of Delaware. We don't think of Delaware as a southern state. It was a southern state. It was a slave state. Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland are going to determine the war's outcome. Delaware, to be honest with you, is fairly easy to deal with. It was a slave state in 1860, but when you look at its population, it was just barely a slave state. It had a free population of 110,000 and a slave population of about 1,800. Less than 2% of the population of Delaware was slave. Less than 5% of the population of Delaware was Black. And so Delaware is just a place where slavery was legal. It had never been repealed, but had long since ceased to be viable. In fact, most of the slaves that lived in Delaware had already been sold off by their masters, who anticipated that Delaware would go the way of New Jersey and of Pennsylvania. But by 1860, the legality of slavery still existed. But by 1860, Delaware, for all practical purposes, was a place where slavery was only legal. It was not particularly viable. As a result of that, all of a sudden you see something we haven't seen before. There was an election. Abraham Lincoln got nearly 4,000 votes. Not enough to be significant, but he did get votes. Douglas, interestingly enough, got less votes than Lincoln. He got about 1,800 votes. But then people who favored slavery, Breckinridge, 3,800, Bell, 3,800. Bell by about 60 votes. By about 60 votes. Every vote counts. By about 60 votes, Bell carried the state of Delaware. Was there an attempt to get Delaware out of the Union? And the answer is yes. When Mississippi left the Union, when Alabama left the Union, Louisiana left the Union, they sent representatives from their states to the remaining states, including Delaware, to encourage them to support and join with the Confederacy. And on January the 3rd, even before Mississippi had formally left the Union, a representative from Mississippi by the name of Henry Dickinson appears in Delaware to speak to the state legislature. And the local newspapers say that his speech was accepted with applause and with hisses. Applause and with hisses. But when it was all over with, the hisses will win, and the state of Delaware's legislature will pass a resolution that says the following: "We express our unqualified disapproval of the remedy for existing difficulties suggested by the resolutions of the legislature of Mississippi." In other words, I don't think so. We're not going to join the Confederacy. It really doesn't suit our needs or our interest, because for all practical purposes, slavery had come to an end. Delaware does furnish a handful of Confederate soldiers. For years, I've tried to get a sense of the extent to which Delaware participated in the Confederate cause. And the best I can tell you is that several companies, not regiments, but several companies of Delaware soldiers were organized. They were typically blended in with Maryland regiments. And then most other people from Delaware who fought in the Civil War joined various and sundry Confederate outfits from other states. And that's why you have such people as, well, Frederick Handy, Frederick Graham Handy. He ends up, of all things, he has a very good college education and education in math. And so he becomes a Confederate naval officer assigned to the James Fleet, which is the fleet that would include, among other things, the USS Virginia or the Merrimack. And so there are Delaware soldiers who fight in the Confederacy, but no significant number. And so Delaware makes very little contribution to the Confederate cause. One thing that does interest me about Delaware, however, was it doesn't get around to ending slavery. Not until the year 2013 does the legislature in the state of Delaware think it to be a good thing to formally adopt the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the amendment that declared slavery to be an end in the United States. Now let's talk about heavy-handedness. Let's talk about being ruthless. Let's talk about doing things that we'll ask whether or not that was legal, moral, and right when it's all over with. And there you have the situation in the state of Maryland. The way I express it is, Maryland was not permitted to join the Confederacy. Maryland was prevented from seceding. If you look at Maryland, like other border states, there are places where slavery is intense. The Baltimore area, the Annapolis area, Eastern Delaware, the Tidewater. There was an intensity of slavery there. Tobacco was grown. That area of the state was strongly dedicated to slave culture. But as you move westward into the mountain regions and the valley regions and the Piedmont, such as it is in Maryland, support for slavery declines dramatically. But for Abraham Lincoln, there was a special problem. And that special problem had a name. It's called the District of Columbia, what today we call Washington, D.C. If Maryland left the Union, then the capital of the United States would be completely surrounded. To the south, you would have Virginia, which had seceded, and to the north, you would have Maryland, which had seceded. It was absolutely critical that Maryland not be allowed to leave the Union. Lincoln had an additional problem. About 50 miles north of Washington is a place called Baltimore. Well, what's the problem with Baltimore? And the answer is Baltimore was overwhelmingly pro-Confederate. But Baltimore was also the place where any troops coming to protect Washington, D.C. had to go through Baltimore. Railroads are important, but railroads have some peculiarities. And in Baltimore, there was a peculiarity. And the peculiarity is that you had a railroad coming from the north that ended up in Baltimore. And you had a railroad that would leave Baltimore and head down to Washington, D.C. and point south. But those two railroads were not compatible. No one had established a standardized gauge between tracks. They were in the process of doing it, but it hadn't been completed in Baltimore. What this means then is that as troops come into Baltimore from the north, heading toward Washington, D.C. to protect Washington, they have to get off the train in Baltimore, march about a quarter of a mile or so, and then board another train on a different set of tracks to head on the way down to to Washington and points further south. And that leads to the first deaths by violence, deaths by hostile action in the American Civil War. You have, in this case, the Baltimore riots. On April 19th, remember Fort Sumter is April 12, 13. Lincoln calls for volunteers on April the 15th. And on April 19th, you have the 6th Massachusetts Volunteers getting off a train in Baltimore and marching several blocks to get back on a train. But at this point, a mob surrounds them. We're familiar with mobs today. A mob surrounds the 6th Massachusetts Volunteers, and they begin to throw stones, and they begin to shoot pistols, and they began to do a number of other, I think what a lot of people today would call naughty things. And the Massachusetts soldiers respond by firing on the mob. And at least 5 people are killed. 5 civilians are killed. In fact, the Baltimore State song, which is sung to the tune of Old Christmas Tree or Tannenbaum, has the phrase, "And the blood that was flecked in Baltimore." We're going to seek revenge for the blood that was flecked in Baltimore. The first death by violence, death by hostile action in the Civil War occurs in these riots in Baltimore. At that point, on April 19th, the war is just getting kind of warmed up. Lincoln realizes he cannot afford for Maryland to leave the Union. No sophistication here. He cannot afford for Maryland to leave the Union. So, 3 days later, the commander of the 8th Massachusetts, which is now going through Baltimore, is given an order. Quieten things down in Baltimore and seize Annapolis. In other words, we need to keep a communication lines open all the way to Annapolis, which was also the capital. And so it just happened that the commander of the 8th Massachusetts Regiment was a fellow who had become quite famous during the American Civil War. We will talk about him in future lectures, a man by the name of Benjamin Butler. And Benjamin Butler, who was a political general, a man who understood politics and symbols, but a man who could also lose a battle because he was a terrible general and offend people mightily because he could be as blunt as they come in getting things accomplished. But Benjamin Butler was sent to Annapolis, which he seized, and he immediately begins to arrest anyone that's pro-Confederate and throw them in jail. And in fact, Lincoln, it's unclear, does Lincoln give the order to have these people arrested, or does Lincoln simply give permission? In other words, he doesn't say anything negative. And so what begins to happen in Maryland is that all across Maryland, anyone that is pro-Confederate is liable to be arrested by the military authorities and thrown in prison. Among those people who were thrown in prison was a man named John Merryman, a Virginia planter, prominent, open, and vociferous in his opposition to the Union. And in fact, he favored the Confederacy. And in May, he will be arrested and thrown in prison and not allowed to have the normal rights you would have as a civilian, like the right to an attorney, the right to appeal for bond so that you could be allowed out of prison. And in the case of Merryman, he sues, and Roger Taney, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, agrees with him. In a famous case called Ex parte Merryman, Roger Taney declares that if there are sitting civilian courts, then the military cannot arbitrarily arrest people and treat them the way a military would treat them, without being given counsel, without being given the opportunity for bail. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that at this point in time, a Supreme Court justice is both a federal judge in charge of the Supreme Court but he also served as a appeals judge. So was Townie speaking as a Supreme Court judge, or was he speaking as an appeals judge? The Lincoln administration chose to decide that he was speaking as an appeals judge, and so they didn't recognize what Townie did as the last word. In other words, you have the Chief Justice of the United States, same Chief Justice, by the way, as the Dred Scott decision, who clearly does not favor Lincoln and clearly favors the Confederate cause, and he's ignored. And the military continues in Maryland, this heavy-handed arresting of anybody that's pro-Confederate, because they cannot allow Maryland to join the Confederacy. And among those who are arrested would be the police chief of Baltimore, the entire city council of Baltimore, and they're thrown into a federal prison without trial, without habeas corpus, without bail, and several dozen people until it climaxes in September, when 1/3 of the legislature, 1/3 of the legislature of Maryland, all of whom were people of known pro-Confederate views, are arrested and thrown in prison. And at that point, there's nobody left to declare Maryland out of the Union. Maryland was not given permission to even consider whether or not it would join the Union. But then there's Missouri and Kentucky. Here, Lincoln has to play a more calm game. He doesn't play that heavy-handed game that he played in Maryland. He doesn't have the situation in Delaware where they don't really want to join the Confederacy. In both Missouri and in Kentucky, there is strong support for the Confederacy. But in truth, the Unionists are also very strong. And initially, what both Kentucky and Missouri wanted to do was to remain neutral, which sounds fine, but it's not practical. In other words, if you're neutral, you might as well favor the Confederacy, because you're saying, we will not allow military movement across our state. So how are you going to invade the Confederacy into Tennessee if you can't cross Kentucky? So a neutral Kentucky works to the benefit of the Confederacy. At the same time, Lincoln cannot afford to have Missouri or Kentucky join the Confederacy for strategic reasons. What about Missouri? Notice Missouri. The existence of slavery might surprise you. It's really across the central part of Missouri to the north and south of the Missouri River. Tobacco, east of Jefferson City, hemp west of Jefferson City. And while it looks like slavery is relatively mild, it's very powerful people are favoring it. All things being equal, Missouri should have voted to remain in the Union. But things weren't equal. And the thing that wasn't equal was the governor of Missouri, a man by the name of Claiborne Fox Jackson. Claiborne Fox Jackson is willing to play heavy-handed. In his case, he's willing to have a military coup, to use the Missouri State Guard, commanded by his friend Sterling Price, to arrest the legislators in Jefferson City, and then have the pro-Confederate legislators declare Missouri to be in favor of the Confederacy. And he and Sterling Price almost pulled that off. I mean, look at what, by the way, he responded to Lincoln's call for volunteers. Jackson said, "Your dispatch of the 15th, Mr. Lincoln, has called for Missourians to send 4 regiment men for immediate service against the South. There can be, I apprehend, no doubt that the men are intended to form a part of the President's army to make war upon the people of the seceding states. Your requisition, Mr. Lincoln, is in my judgment illegal, unconstitutional, and voluntarily and revolutionary." By the way, the mayor of Portland couldn't have said it better speaking to President Trump. and cannot be complied with. Not one man will the state of Missouri furnish to carry on any unholy crusade against the South. And so he had declared that he favored the Confederacy, declared it very strongly, and he was intending to use General Sterling Price to take over the legislature in Jefferson City and leave only pro-Confederate people there. And they met the man that would probably save the entire Union, General Nathaniel Lyon. In the course of the American Civil War, there's certain essential people who were the right persons at the right place to change everything. Right person at the right place to change everything. Nathaniel Lyon was a general, a brigadier general in the Federal Army. He was stationed in St. Louis at the arsenal. In fact, it was the largest arsenal in the United States because it was the arsenal that fed the military going out into the American West. But he was not in command. He had at least two people who were superior to him. But Nathaniel Lyon had a couple of things going for him. First of all, he was a rabid abolitionist, no question about it. Secondly, he had figured out that the Germans who had been settling in St. Louis since the 1840s were also rabid abolitionists. And so he formed a group called the Wide Awakes, which was a kind of paramilitary group of Germans in case something happened. And sure enough, when he found out that Claiborne Jackson was going to have a coup, he took the Wide Awakes and a couple of companies of federal soldiers, and they got on a railroad train, and the railroad went all the way to Jefferson City. And so Price and Claiborne Jackson and a handful of the Missouri State Guard immediately fled Jefferson City and went about 40 miles to the west to a little community called Boonville, where the railroad ended. And Jackson, this man of action, rabid abolitionist, working pretty much on his own, caught up with the Missouri State Guard, which was pro-secession at Boonville, and they fought the Little Battle of Boonville, 17 June 1861, which, believe it or not, Lyon had 1,700 troops, the Missouri State Guard about 1,500. The battle lasted about 30 minutes. About 5 people were killed on both sides, but the Missouri Guard, which was not very well trained, retreated immediately. This was likely one of the more important battles of the American Civil War because it meant that Jackson and Sterling Price would not be successful in their attempt to take over Missouri for the Confederacy. The Battle of Boonville, 17 June 1861, by any standard, a mere scrimmage by everything that will happen later in the war, is in fact one of the more important battles. It determined the fate of the Union in June 1861. But what happened to Lyon? All things being equal, Lyon should have become one of the great generals of the American Civil War, except the Confederacy invaded Missouri in August of 1861. There is the Battle of Wilson's Creek, and leading his own soldiers at Wilson's Creek, Lyon was killed, and the Union forces retreated. The Confederacy briefly had control of Missouri, not by much. The Missouri legislature, the Confederate legislature, met briefly in Neosho, which is just right on the border with Oklahoma now, in Indian Territory, and it officially seceded from the Union and formed a Confederate government on October 30, so that Missouri becomes the 12th of 13 stars in the Confederate battle flag. As for where that government would meet for the rest of the American Civil War, the Confederate government of Missouri, in exile, spent most of the American Civil War in Marshall, Texas. Kentucky, again, Kentucky tried to be neutral. On May 16th, the legislature declared that. Lincoln didn't like it, but at least he wasn't going for the Confederacy. The neutralities said any side, federal or Confederate, that sets foot on Kentucky, well, we'll decide for the other side. At that point, a Confederate general of merit, a good Confederate general, he made a military judgment that turned out to be a terrible political judgment. The military judgment was he was just going to cross barely into Kentucky to a place called Columbus to get a slightly better military position overlooking the Mississippi River. But that constituted an invasion of Kentucky. And so the Unionists then, in Lexington, in Frankfort, the capital, immediately said, okay, that's it. We're for the Union. And Kentucky remained in the Union for the rest of the war, except that on December 10th, 1861, a small number of politicians from Kentucky met and created a Kentucky government in exile. And so Kentucky will then form the 13th star, but in all practical purposes, not the 13th state of the Confederacy. The failure of the Confederacy to gain those 4 states, especially the states of Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, would determine the outcome of the war in favor of the Union. Well, let's go back to that little word that I love so well, coda. Just a little something to end. And I thought I would like, since we're talking about Kentucky, I'd like to end on something that is both tragic and a little light. The tragedy involves the death of Benjamin Harden Helm. The Helm family is one I'm familiar with. I've actually written a couple of articles about them in their post-war lives. But one of the children of the Helm family, very much pro-Confederate, was Benjamin Harden Helm, who becomes a Confederate general. And he's successful. He's a pretty good general, and not the best, not the worst. But he is killed. Even generals got killed in the Confederacy. He's killed at the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863. And he had married his second wife. His first wife had died, who was much younger than him. And her name was Emily Todd Helm. In other words, she was a Todd of the Kentucky Todds, most of whom were pro-Confederate. Why is that important? Well, because Emily Todd Helm was the half-sister of someone you're much more familiar with, Mary Todd Lincoln. Now consider this. It's September 1863, many tragedies in the war. Benjamin Helm Harden, yet another tragedy. He now has a young widow who has 3 or 4 children. And because of the situation, she cannot return to her home in Kentucky. She's deep down in Tennessee. So she writes to her sister, her half-sister, Mary Todd Lincoln, and explains her circumstance. Well, Emily and Mary Todd were close. In fact, in the pre-war period, Lincoln and Benjamin Harden Helm had been good friends because they were, in essence, brother-in-laws. And so Lincoln gives permission for Emily Todd to come visit and stay for a while at the White House while she's sorting out what she as a widow will do with the rest of her life. In early 1864, Emily Todd, with her children, move into the White House. And they're welcomed by Mary Todd and Abraham. But can you imagine this now? The widow of a Confederate general is living in the White House, and the age of her children and the age of the Lincoln children are about the same. So the youngest Todd boys and the youngest Lincoln boys, they play Union and Confederate soldiers. And by the way, in the process of doing it, they destroyed quite a number of antiques as they battled around the different rooms of the White House. And the oldest daughter of Emily Todd and Robert Todd, the oldest son of Abraham, engage in political discussions. One of which is, who's the better president, the president of the Confederacy or the president of the Union? But more than that, Abraham Lincoln's enemies began to argue that there's a spy in the White House. And Lincoln begins to realize he's in political trouble because Mary Todd's half-sister is living in the White House. And so in what I think was probably one of the most difficult things that Lincoln did during the entire course of the American Civil War, He sat down with his wife and said to her, "Your sister has got to move out," which she did. Abraham Lincoln makes sure that she is sent back to Kentucky, that she is protected in herself and in her property, though he specifically says, "As to her slaves, I will make no recommendation." And that's the story of the little Civil War that occurred at the White House, because Kentucky was one of those places where slavery was marginal and where the Civil War was fought. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and now we have a sense of how the Confederacy was established. We're going to look at something much broader next week. We're going to see the Civil War as it fit within the context of everything that was happening in the world, and the fate of the American Union and the possible creation of a Confederate States of America held power in abeyance for the entire globe, something you may never have thought about. But that's what we're going to look at next week. Okay, Misha or Shelby or whoever's in charge, I'm open to discussion.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or ask. Shelby says, "Awesome presentation. Do you make your own slides?"
I'm sorry, with my ego, I got caught up with the awesome presentation. I did not hear the last phrase.
Shelby asked, "Do you make your own slides?"
Oh, do I make my own slides? The answer is yes. But you've got to remember, I'm retired, so I've got plenty of time to do it.
I guess Max and Barbara have a question.
Certainly. Hi, Max.
Hey, Fred, how are you doing? Good to be with you again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. It's a little, I can understand you.
Okay. I don't know if it's an observation or a question necessarily, but it seems to me, hearing about the attitudes and the determination, the hell-bound determination of the South to succeed at all, to secede, not succeed, but succeed at all costs.
It did secede, it did not succeed. Okay.
Yeah, right, yeah. Their determination to succeed, all argument against reasoning, seems to me to parallel almost today's attitudes with the differences in the Democratic and the Republican Party. And is it just me, or does anyone else see a parallel in this?
No, you're right. The thing is, sometimes our culture is fairly calm. But the truth of the matter is that we have one of the most dynamic cultures in the world. And it's really, the culture we live in is really dealing with something that I began to work with when I was in grad school. I began to see something that told me that this simple dichotomy, this simple division into people that are liberal and conservative don't quite fit. I have views that are incredibly conservative, and I have views that are significantly liberal, to be perfectly honest with you. And and yet at the same time, I can fit them into my overall view of what is right and wrong in the world. So how can I do it? And I've discovered is that a lot of it has to do with this phrase, liberty versus order. Liberty is a good thing. Liberty is freedom. Liberty is the right to speak your mind and to express your opinions and to have new ideas and to explore. But liberty taken to its extreme will result in anarchy, okay? Now, what's the opposite of liberty? The opposite of liberty is order. Order is structure and its rules and its regulations. And that's a good thing because the absence of rules leads to anarchy. So if you have rules and regulations and structure, then you can somewhat count on what the future will be because you've got a set of rules there to work with. Unfortunately, order taken to its extreme is oppression, okay? So when you find people who don't like Trump and they accuse him of being a Nazi, which he's not, but when they accuse him of that, it's because he is a friend of order, okay? And they take that sense of order to the extreme that we're all going to be oppressed, whereas the friends of order take what the, for lack of a better term, the left wing believes in and says that's going to lead to anarchy. Now here's what's really scary. Either way leads to disaster. If you have anarchy, then the only way to put anarchy down, the only way to prevent the kind of arbitrarily shooting people in the face, for example, is to oppress people. In other words, to send people out that will put an end to all of this. And so that's where we are today. We've gone to extremes on both liberty and order, and we've got to be able to pull back to a more moderate position where we can talk to people about things we wish to get done without accusing, say, Trump of making war on the American people, or accusing others of believing in no law at all and trying to run the country into some kind of socialist paradise.
Wow.
I think I just pulled a Henry Rector. I made an enemy of everybody.
Right, Linda?
That explains a lot, and I tend to agree with you completely on that. It's worrisome to me, and we've only got a little less now, I think, than 8 weeks before the election, and it just seems to me that some of the Democrats are determined one way or another, and that's sort of a frightening phrase, one way or another, to see that Trump is not reelected, regardless of what the vote turns out to be. And
Well, what worries me is faith in the election.
yeah,
What makes our country work is that we have faith in our elections. And what makes our country work is that when we lose an election, we don't lose our sense of being American. We don't lose our sense of, this is the end. And when you reach that end, you've got two choices, and you either succumb or you fight. And that's why it worried me from the beginning when people started using the word resistance, because resistance is saying, I don't accept the outcome of the election.
right.
And it's fearful to me.
Yes, it is. It is to me. It certainly is.
Now, to show you my political sophistication, you're familiar with Parade magazine.
Yeah.
Okay. And, they have these, fill out these 10 points, and we'll tell you who you're going to vote for. Well, okay. So invariably, I fill out those 10 points, and I'm usually to the left of Hillary Clinton, okay, when I fill out the 10 points. And I can assure you, Hillary Clinton was the last person I was going to vote for in the year 2016. So you can't use those liberal and conservative things to determine where somebody stands politically.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Fred. It was fascinating today. Thank you very much for presenting it.
Well, thank you. If you're trying to figure out why the Civil War is important globally, I'll give you a geographic location. And you just reflect till next week on how on earth this whole Civil War could relate to that. Panama.
All right, Linda has a question.
Okay. Hi, Linda.
I enjoy your presentations as always, and I was just curious if you're going to email us the handouts like you did last spring.
Let me Misha, did you send those PDFs out that I sent you?
I haven't gotten any PDFs recently. And now Fred's frozen.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that you haven't, because anyway, I'll send Misha a PDF of my last lecture, as I will also send the same thing of this lecture, and hopefully she'll be able to share them with everybody. Okay.
Yes, definitely. I can do that.
But I'm glad to hear you didn't get it, because I was wondering why you didn't send it.
Yeah. Makes sense. Becky Reeves says, so Kentucky remained neutral during the entire war, but were there many battles fought in that state? Did Kentucky contribute many soldiers to the war or provisions?
I don't have the exact number of soldiers that Kentucky contributed, but about 2/3 of the soldiers that fought during the Civil War from Kentucky fought with the Union, and about 1/3 fought with Kentucky. And the same thing was true of Missouri and of Maryland. Delaware, I spent years, now not intense study, but I've spent years trying to figure out Delaware in the Civil War. And only recently have I finally gotten a few clues as to its relationship to the Confederacy, which is simply said, not much. As for battles, oh my goodness, big and small. There were major battles fought in Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland. I mean, Antietam is in Maryland. But even worse, some of the most tragic elements of the American Civil War are fought in Maryland and Missouri and Kentucky, because the phrase neighbor against neighbor, sometimes it had nothing to do with slavery. Sometimes it was just old feuds between neighbors. The classic of all of that is the post-war feud between the Hatfields and McCoys in the border region between Kentucky and West Virginia. I have two relatives. Remember, I'm born in Arkansas, and my family is from Tennessee and Arkansas. And two of my relatives I can identify as participating in the war. They both fought for the Union. In the case of my Tennessee relative, he was from the Piney Woods country. Most of his neighbors joined the 10th Tennessee Cavalry Union, which I'm glad he didn't, because they ended up in Andersonville and 60% of them died. He ends up joining Ulysses S. Grant's army down in Mississippi, and I think just the first group he came to, which was the 7th Kansas Cavalry. Well, the 7th Kansas Cavalry are the old abolitionist Jayhawkers, and since they knew Missouri better than anybody, they were sent back with him to fight the guerrilla battles in Missouri, which was no holds barred, inhumanity, terrible stuff. And so he's fighting with the Union cause against people like Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson that just made a terrible situation for the state of Missouri. East Tennessee, same thing. Okay, Western North Carolina, same thing. Neighbor against neighbor, feud against feud, no humanity shown. Well, we got started late, and I think we're kind of running out of time. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're pretty much out of time, but we
Okay.
appreciate you doing your presentation. It was wonderful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's fun to put together, and I'm glad all of you got to participate. And I'd love to be able to see you in person. Okay. Thank you all very much. I'm gonna lean back and just let everything kind of reside now. Okay.
All right. Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much, Fred. Thank you, everybody, for coming.